There are griefs that belong to everyone, and there are griefs that belong to one person alone, that exist in a space too private, too specific, too deeply interior to be shared without being diminished by the sharing. The difference between the two is not a matter of the size of the loss. It is a matter of what the loss contains and who is able to hold it properly. On December 14th, 1980, 6 days after John Lennon was shot outside the Dakota building, Yoko Ono did not hold a public funeral. She did not invite Paul McCartney. She did not invite Ringo Starr. She did not invite Julian Lennon, who was 17 years old and had just lost a father he had been in the careful, imperfect process of knowing again. She did not invite the friends, the collaborators, the people who had been part of John's life across the decades and who had their own relationship with his loss. She did not invite the press. She did not invite the world, which had been mourning loudly and visibly for 6 days in Central Park and in public squares and on radio stations and in the newspapers that were covering the event with the scale and intensity that the event seemed to require. Instead, she took Sean, who was 5 years old, who had just learned what it meant that his father was not coming home, and she went to a private place and she said goodbye. And she read a letter. The letter was not one she had written. It was one John had written years earlier in a different context for a different purpose, addressed to Yoko in the specific and private language of a marriage that had survived more than it was given credit for surviving, and that had, in its later years, achieved the particular quality of settled love that is different from early love in the way that a house is different from the idea of a house. A letter full of the things John Lennon said when he was speaking to the person he trusted most, in the voice he used when no one else was listening. Outside the Dakota, thousands of people stood in the December cold. They held candles, they sang. They wept for someone they had never met, but who had given them something so real and so personal that the loss felt specific, individual, addressed to them. The grief outside the building was enormous and genuine and public in the way that the public grief of a generation always is. Inside, or in whatever private space Yoko had found, a 5-year-old boy sat beside his mother while she read his father's words aloud in a room that contained no witnesses except the two people who needed to be there. What the letter said has never been made public. What Yoko has said about that day has been sparse and carefully chosen, the speech of someone who has decided, with the same absolute certainty with which she has made every important decision of her life, what belongs to the world and what does not. This is the story of that decision, and of what the private goodbye contained that the public one could not. Yoko Ono was not John Lennon's first wife. She was not the first person he had loved or the first person who had loved him. She was something more specific and more rare, the first person who had seen him completely, had encountered the full complexity of who he was, including the parts he had spent his entire public life managing and concealing and converting into the wit and the sharpness and the performed ease that the world received as his character, and had not required him to be different. This sounds simple. It is not simple. The capacity to be genuinely, completely seen by another person, not performed at, not celebrated, not mythologized, not received through the intermediary of a public identity that has grown up between the actual person and the world, is one of the rarest things available to human beings, and it becomes rarer in direct proportion to the scale of the fame that surrounds you. John had been famous since he was 23. By the time he met Yoko at the Indica Gallery in November 1966, he had spent 3 years inside one of the most intense and consuming public identities the modern world had produced. He had been seen by hundreds of millions of people. He had not been seen by almost any of them. Yoko saw him. She was not a Beatles fan. She was an artist with her own established practice, her own developed aesthetic, her own body of work that had nothing to do with pop music or celebrity culture. She encountered him as a person at an art opening, engaged with what he thought and felt and made rather than with what he represented, pushed back when she disagreed and did not perform fascination she did not feel. He did not know what to do with this at first. He was accustomed to a world that oriented itself around him, and here was someone who had not oriented herself around him and showed no signs of intending to do so. The disorientation of genuine encounter, of being with someone who was not responding to the public version, but to the actual one, was, he later said, the most uncomfortable and the most necessary experience of his adult life. Their relationship developed across the following years, with the particular intensity of something that is happening. At depth, not always smooth on the surface, not always easy to explain or defend to the world outside, but rooted in something real enough to survive the considerable pressures that were brought to bear on it. The world brought considerable pressures. The hostility directed at Yoko from the moment she appeared in John's life was sustained and specific and ugly in the particular way that hostility is ugly when it is rooted in things the people expressing it cannot name, in the displacement of more complicated feelings onto an available target, in the specific ugliness of a culture that decides a woman is responsible for what a man has chosen and punishes her for the choosing. She was blamed for the Beatles' dissolution. She was dismissed as a manipulator. She was treated, in public discourse and in private communications that John saw and responded to with consistent and absolute defense, as something that had happened to John Lennon rather than someone he had freely, deliberately, with full knowledge of what it was costing him, chosen. He never wavered, not publicly and not privately. His defense of Yoko was one of the most consistent things about him across the years of public life after their marriage, the thing that did not shift with mood or circumstance or the particular pressure of a given moment. He was clear about it in interviews. He was clear about it in the music, in the songs that addressed their relationship directly, in the influence on his creative practice that he acknowledged with increasing honesty as the years passed. He was clear about it in the way he organized his life. The decision to step back from music in 1975 was made together with Yoko, in the context of a partnership that had by that point developed into something that the early turbulent years had not yet been. The 5 years of domestic quiet, the bread baking, the Central Park walks, the Sean-centered mornings, were years that both of them chose together and that both of them lived together in the Dakota apartment. Yoko managed their business affairs. John managed their domestic life. The arrangement was unusual and was misunderstood by almost everyone outside it, but it was genuine, a partnership that had found its own form rather than fitting itself into the available forms that society provided. And then there was the letter. John Lennon wrote constantly. Letters, journal entries, song fragments, observations, drawings, the particular stream of consciousness that ran under everything he made and occasionally surfaced in his art. Some of this writing was addressed to specific people, some of it was addressed to himself, some of it occupied the space between the two, addressed to Yoko, but in the register of someone processing something through the act of writing rather than composing a communication for delivery. The letter that Yoko read at the private ceremony was one of these. Written at some point during their years together, the specific date has never been confirmed, though the internal evidence of what it contained suggests the later years, the settled years, the years after the 5-year silence and the return to music. It was not a letter that John had marked for preservation or designated as significant. It was simply something he had written to her, in the voice he used when he was not performing anything, because she was the person he did not perform for. What it contained, what its specific words said, is something Yoko has chosen not to share. This is a choice that deserves respect rather than interrogation. The instinct to know what it said is understandable, but the instinct to preserve it within the relationship it was part of is more important. Some things are written for one reader and remain, even after both the writer and the intended reader have been moved through by the enormous machinery of public grief, in the possession of the person they were written for. What Yoko has said in the sparse, chosen words she has offered on the subject of that day is that the letter said what she needed to hear, that it said things that could only have been written by someone who knew her completely. That reading it aloud in the presence of their 5-year-old son was, in some way she has found difficult to articulate, a form of introduction, John speaking to Sean through the letter, the father's voice reaching the child through the mother's reading of it, the words crossing time and the specific unbridgeable gap of December 8th and landing in a room where they were needed. Sean was 5 years old. He sat beside his mother and heard his father's words read aloud in a private room, and what he understood of them, what a 5-year-old is able to understand of the things adults write to each other in the privacy of their truest correspondence, was perhaps not the specific meaning but something more fundamental. The quality of the voice, the fact of the voice, his father speaking even now. Outside, the thousands continued their vigil. The decision not to invite Paul McCartney or Ringo Starr or Julian Lennon to the private ceremony has been, across the years, one of the things that the world has found most difficult to accept about Yoko Ono. The difficulty is understandable and the conclusion it has led to is wrong. The world has wanted to interpret the exclusion as hostility, as the final, definitive act of a woman who had spent 15 years being blamed for separating John from the people who mattered, now literally separating them at the final moment. This interpretation is satisfying and coherent and pays no attention to what Yoko actually said about the decision, which is this: she was protecting a space. She was protecting a space in which John Lennon could be mourned by the people whose loss was most specific, most interior, most impossible to share with witnesses. A 5-year-old boy needed to say goodbye to his father. A wife needed to say goodbye to her husband. The presence of other people, even people who had their own real relationship with the loss, even Paul and Ringo and Julian, whose grief was genuine and whose claim on John was real, would have changed the quality of that space in ways that would have served everyone's grief except the grief it was specifically for. Paul McCartney mourned John. He did so with the imprecision of genuine shock in the public statements he made in the days after, which were clumsy in the way that real shock makes language clumsy. He has mourned him across the decades since with an honesty that has deepened as the years have passed, that has moved from the raw difficulty of the immediate aftermath toward something more settled and more willing to engage with the complexity of what the relationship was. His grief was real. It was not the grief that needed to be in that room. Julian Lennon mourned his father with the specific, unrepeatable pain of someone who had been in the process of rebuilding what had been broken, who had been close enough to the repair to see what it was going to look like, and who now had to hold that vision in one hand and the permanent impossibility of its completion in the other. His grief was real and particular, and deserved its own space rather than being absorbed into someone else's ceremony. Yoko did not owe Julian a place in her private goodbye. She owed him the space to have his own, which is different. What she created by keeping the ceremony closed was a container, small enough to hold only what it needed to hold, private enough to allow what needed to actually happen without the presence of witnesses who would, through no fault of their own, simply by being present, have converted the private act into a public one. She read the letter in that container. Sean sat beside her. John's voice, in his own words, was in the room. The public memorial happened on December 14th, 1980, simultaneously in New York and in cities around the world. Yoko had asked people to gather in silence at the same time in Central Park, 10 minutes of silence held together across the world. Hundreds of thousands of people stood in the cold and were quiet, and the quiet was its own enormous thing, the sound of a generation absorbing a loss that had not finished being absorbed. This was the public face of what Yoko was doing, the gesture toward the world, the acknowledgement that John's loss was not only hers, that the grief outside the Dakota was real and deserved a form and a time. She had provided that form and that time. She had not been present for it in the way that public figures at public memorials are present. She had been at the appointed hour wherever the private ceremony had taken her. Both things were real. The 10 minutes of silence in Central Park was real. The private room with the letter was real. The grief of the world and the grief of one woman and one child were not competing versions of the same loss. They were different losses, requiring different containers, and Yoko had provided both, the public container and the private one, with the characteristic clarity of someone who has always understood the difference between what belongs to everyone and what belongs to her alone. Sean Lennon grew up to be a musician. This is not a surprise. But the particular quality of his musical voice, the emotional directness, the willingness to be undefended in the music, the sense of someone speaking from somewhere genuinely interior rather than from the surface of a crafted public identity, carries something that people who knew John's music from the inside have remarked on with a consistency that suggests it is not imagined. He has spoken, across the years, about his mother with a love and a specificity that reflects the closeness of their relationship and the particular bond that is formed between a parent and child who have been through something irreplaceable together. He has spoken about his father with the complexity that the situation deserves, not the simple, burnished tribute of someone performing filial piety, but the honest account of someone who knew a version of the person that the world did not know, who carries that version in a way that the world's version does not contain. He has not spoken specifically about the private ceremony. He was 5 years old. Whatever he understood of what happened in that room, whatever was absorbed rather than comprehended, belongs to the same category as the letter itself, private, interior, not requiring a wider audience to be real. Yoko Ono has remained, in the years since 1980, the keeper of what John left. Not only the archive, the recordings, the art, the documentation, but the quality of the relationship, the particular understanding of who he was that only she possessed, the sense of what he was for beyond what he is publicly remembered as being. She has maintained this with a consistency and a fidelity that have been, in the public world, largely invisible, because the public world is interested in the icon, and the keeper of the icon is always less interesting than the icon itself. The letter is part of what she keeps. What it says, she keeps. The room in which she read it, she keeps. The 5-year-old boy who sat beside her and heard his father's voice through his mother's reading of it, the grown man that boy became carries whatever was received in that room, in whatever form it was received at 5 years old, as part of whatever he is. John Lennon spoke to Yoko in the letter. The letter was written before December 8th and read after it. Between the writing and the reading, everything happened that happened, and the words landed in the aftermath and were received by the person they were written for in the only ceremony that mattered. Outside, the world mourned. Inside the room, two people finished a conversation. The world will never know what was said. This is correct. This is exactly as it should be. Some things are written for one person. When they reach that person, they are complete. What does it mean to keep something private when the world wants to share your grief, and what does the choice to keep it private say about the nature of what is being kept? Yoko Ono read a letter in a private room and has not shared what it said. That is the whole story. Everything else, the public memorials, the vigils, the decades of tribute, is what surrounds it. The letter is what is at the center.